I fell on the kitchen floor while home alone with their child. When they returned, my daughter-in-law said, "If you're too weak to babysit, don't volunteer." My son added, "You scared her, maybe it's time you stop pretending you're capable." That night, I packed a small bag. What they didn't know was that by the end of the week, someone else would be showing up to discuss custody of. I didn't plan to fall. It wasn't dramatic. No warning, no time to brace myself. One second I was standing at the kitchen counter in their house in Naperville, cutting up strawberries for my granddaughter, and the next my knees gave out like they weren't mine anymore. The tile was cold when I hit it, hard enough to knock the breath out of me, but not hard enough to make me black out. I remembered the silence right after. Then the crying. She was in her high chair behind me, just 2 years old, watching it happen. At first she didn't understand. Then I guess she saw me not getting up and something in her shifted. She started screaming, the kind of scared, high-pitched cry that makes your chest tighten. I tried to get up, I really did. But my arms felt weak, and there was this sharp, deep pain in my hip that made it impossible to put weight on one side. So I stayed there on the kitchen floor, trying to keep my voice calm while I told her it was okay, that Grandma was fine, that everything was fine. It was. I crawled, that's the part I still feel ashamed of. I had to drag myself across their kitchen just to reach the chair and pull myself halfway up. I managed to stand eventually, but not straight. I got to her, unbuckled her, held her against me while she cried into my shoulder. She didn't stop crying for a long time. And neither did I, not really. By the time my son and his wife got home that evening, I was sitting on the couch with an ice pack wrapped in a dish towel, trying to act like nothing had happened. But toddlers don't keep secrets. She ran to them the second they walked in, clinging to her mother's leg, still shaky, still upset. My daughter-in-law barely looked at me before asking, "What happened?" I told her I didn't exaggerate, I didn't dramatize. I just said I slipped and fell, that I was okay now, that their daughter got scared but she was fine. There was this pause. Then she sighed. Not concern, not relief, just annoyance. "If you're too weak to babysit," she said, dropping her bag on the counter, "don't volunteer." I felt that land harder than the fall. Before I could even respond, my son stepped in. Calm, detached, the same tone he used when he was explaining something inconvenient at work. "You scared her," he added. "She's still shaking. Maybe it's time you stop pretending you're capable." Pretending. That word stayed with me. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. I just nodded like I understood, like they were being reasonable, like I hadn't just spent the entire afternoon in pain trying to take care of their child. I left shortly after, said I needed to rest. They didn't stop me. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed in my apartment, staring at my phone for a long time before I finally opened my contacts. There was a number I hadn't called in years. Not since before my son got married. Not since things got complicated. I packed a small bag first, just essentials, clothes for a few days, my medication, documents I hadn't looked at in a long time but suddenly felt important. Then I made the call. The voice on the other end didn't sound surprised to hear from me. Just quiet, listening. By the time I hung up, my hands weren't shaking anymore. Because what my son and his wife didn't understand, what they had never bothered to ask, was that I wasn't pretending anything. And the person I had just called. They had been waiting for a reason to step back in. By the end of the week, they were going to show up at my son's front door. Not to argue. Not to apologize. But to open a conversation my son thought had been buried years ago. A conversation about custody. And the truth behind why I had really fallen that afternoon, something I hadn't told anyone yet, was going to make sure they never saw me the same way again. I've always been the kind of mother who took care of everything. My son, my home, family emergencies, you name it. I was reliable. That's what people called me. I was proud of it. Proud enough that when he got married to Jessica, my daughter-in-law, I thought she'd understand, or at least appreciate, the effort it took to raise him right. Naperville isn't a small town, but it's close enough that everyone knows your business if you let them. Jessica came from a world where she never had to rely on anyone but herself, and she made sure my son learned the same. He's always been the type to keep the peace, to take the middle road, to avoid conflict. It's part of why he's a good father, I suppose, but it's also why he let her speak to me like that, why he let her make me feel small in my own home. It wasn't always this way. In fact, for a long time it was just the three of us, my son, me, and his little sister, back when she was alive. I raised him alone after my ex-husband left. I worked nights, days, weekends. I did whatever it took. I remember those nights when I was bone tired, rocking him to sleep in the dark, whispering stories just to hear his little laughter before he drifted off. I didn't care about me then. I cared about him. That's why it hurts so much now, watching him stand beside her, letting her words cut me down like I was some stranger, pretending, weak, incapable, and I didn't even recognize the house anymore. Everything smelled different, new furniture, new rugs, her perfume lingering in corners, and I felt like I didn't belong there anymore. I could have stayed silent like I usually did, just endured, but something in me snapped that night. I couldn't go back to pretending I didn't see what they saw. They thought they knew me because they lived with me, because I fed them, watched their child, tried to keep peace. But they didn't know the whole story. They didn't know the part about what happened to me before any of this, the part that made me strong in ways they couldn't even imagine. Years ago, before my son's birth, I was in a different life. A life where I had to fight for survival in a way that doesn't compare to scraped knees or toddler tantrums. A life where I learned that people who think they have power over you only do because you let them. And I had never forgotten that. I'd buried it, kept it safe for the moments when I'd really need it. Moments like this. Moments when I couldn't just cry on the kitchen floor and be ignored. I opened an old filing cabinet that night in my apartment. Pulling out folders that were yellowed at the edges, I found the papers I had hoped I'd never have to use. Court documents, affidavits, old phone records, a few notes on lawyers I trusted implicitly. I had kept everything, anticipating the day when someone underestimated me, and apparently that day had arrived. By the time I sat back on my bed, I was no longer trembling from pain or humiliation. I was calculating, not revenge yet, not fully, but preparation. I could feel the momentum shifting. They thought this was a simple incident, a fall, a mistake, a weak old woman overreaching. They didn't see it as a trigger. I did. That phone call I made, that wasn't to a friend. It wasn't to anyone who would just give sympathy. It was to the one person with authority to shake the foundations of my son's life, the person who could make sure that by the end of the week, the custody of their child, the very thing they took for granted, would be questioned. I thought about their faces as they dismissed me in the kitchen, their smirks, the casual cruelty in their voices. I pictured that same expression when someone else, someone with real power, showed up to confront them. And in that thought, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a rush of clarity. I wasn't broken, I wasn't weak, and this week they were going to learn exactly what that meant. But I had no idea how fast the dominoes were about to fall, or how much it would hurt to watch them tumble. The next morning I woke up before my phone rang. That call from the previous night wasn't enough to set things in motion immediately. There were procedures, schedules, lawyers, and a judge who didn't care about family dynamics. They cared about proof, documentation, strategy. I had both in spades. I'd spent years gathering it quietly, never knowing when it might come in handy, and now it was ready. I drove to the courthouse downtown, slipping past early morning traffic. The city was waking up, oblivious, as if nothing had happened in my world overnight. I pulled into the visitors' parking, clutching my small bag on the passenger seat. Inside were not just clothes or personal items. I had folders with everything, the child's pediatric records. A diary my granddaughter's preschool teacher had kept about certain incidents, emails, receipts, screenshots. Small things that collectively painted a story my son and his wife would never be able to argue away. When I got to the clerk's office, I didn't even wait to be processed. I asked to speak to someone about filing an emergency petition regarding custody. The woman behind the counter gave me a skeptical look. "Do you have a lawyer?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. "I do," I said, and I gave her the name. She typed it in, her brow furrowing as she read the name, then nodded. It seemed the lawyer I'd reached out to last night had already filed a preliminary motion and asked the court to expedite it. By mid-morning, I was walking out with a court date already set for 3 days later. I felt a strange thrill, a clarity that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. For months, my son and his wife had treated me like a volunteer extra in their lives, someone who could be used, discarded, or humiliated at whim. But now the game had changed. The leverage wasn't emotional. It was legal, procedural, undeniable. I spent the afternoon strategizing, quietly and methodically. I mapped out every interaction with my granddaughter, every incident that showed neglect or dismissal of her emotional needs. I made timelines, marked inconsistencies in my son's statements, and outlined everything my daughter-in-law had done to undermine me. I didn't feel anger in the usual way. I felt something sharper, more precise. The kind of anger that isn't loud, it's cold, deliberate, and patient. Then I went home, cooked dinner, packed some more. Every detail mattered. I didn't want them to know I was about to strike until it was too late to stop it. That evening I got a text from my son. "Are you okay? Mom, we're worried. Can we talk?" I didn't answer, not yet, because answering meant giving them a chance to defend themselves or talk me out of it, and that wasn't part of my plan. Instead, I sat with my granddaughter, reading her a story, letting her cling to me a little longer than usual. She didn't know what I was doing, of course. She didn't know that the storm coming for her parents was already in motion, and I prayed she never would. She deserved innocence in all of this. Late that night, I reviewed the email I'd sent to my lawyer one last time. I included photographs, text exchanges, and notes from her preschool. Every word, every image had a purpose. They painted a picture I could never have articulated in front of my son or his wife without sounding bitter or vindictive, but stripped of context, it spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. By the time I turned off the lights, I felt more alive than I had in years. The fall on the kitchen floor had been the spark, yes, but it wasn't the cause. The cause was neglect, subtle, persistent, and dangerous in ways my son refused to see. And now I had a weapon sharper than anger: certainty. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the apartment made me tense. I imagined Jessica walking into the living room, seeing the folders, seeing me calmly sitting there, knowing she had underestimated me. I imagined my son realizing, just before the court date, that he hadn't prepared for the real battle. And yet, as precise as I had been in planning, I had no idea that what was coming would not just shake their household, but upend everything I thought I knew about my own son, something that would leave me questioning not just their capacity as parents, but the man I thought I had raised. Because by the end of this week, this fight wouldn't just be about custody. It would be about trust, betrayal, and a secret my son had buried so deep I wasn't sure he remembered it himself. And that secret, I was about to pull it into the light. The knock came late morning on Thursday. I wasn't expecting it myself. I had been preparing for my lawyer to arrive with papers, but instead it was someone else entirely. A tall man in a grey suit, carrying a leather briefcase, his presence calm but unmistakably authoritative. He introduced himself as Detective Ramirez from the Cook County Juvenile Division. I froze. "I'm here to speak about your granddaughter," he said, and the way he said it didn't leave room for small talk. "We've received reports concerning her safety while in her parents' care." I blinked. Reports? What reports? He opened the briefcase and slid a folder across the kitchen table. Inside were photographs. At first glance, they seemed mundane. A picture of my granddaughter in her high chair, a couple of shots of the living room, a snapshot of her bedroom. But the timestamps told a story. Each picture corresponded to moments I had been at their house. The falls, the tantrums, the times she had been left alone for longer than acceptable. I looked up, confused. This isn't from me. Who? "Neighbors," he said quietly, "daycare staff, and one anonymous tip we received yesterday." He leaned forward slightly. "It appears your daughter-in-law has been leaving the child unattended frequently. The fall yesterday wasn't an isolated incident." I felt a cold rush in my chest. I hadn't expected that. I had been preparing to argue in court, to bring evidence myself, but I hadn't realized someone else was already building a case against them. Then he said it. "Given your involvement and the information you've provided voluntarily, we believe it's in the child's best interest that she not be left with her parents until an investigation is complete." I had to sit down. The room spun. My small act of calling the lawyer, my meticulous collection of documents, my pain and humiliation on the kitchen floor, it wasn't just a prelude to custody discussions anymore. It had triggered a full-scale investigation. "What does this mean?" I whispered. Ramirez's eyes were steady. "Temporary custody could be placed with you, but we need to proceed carefully. If your son or his wife interferes, it complicates matters legally." I nodded, suddenly realizing the weight of what was happening. I wasn't just preparing revenge. I had unknowingly handed the authorities evidence they needed to act, and now the balance of power had shifted entirely. Later that evening, I went over the emails, texts, and preschool notes again. Every piece lined up perfectly. I realized with a grim satisfaction that this week, the very week they had mocked me for pretending to be capable, would be the week they had no control at all. But here's the twist: they didn't know the biggest secret yet, the one about my son. I never expected him to betray me, but as I prepared for the court hearing, Detective Ramirez handed me a second folder. It wasn't about Jessica. It was about him. There were records of his finances, emails between him and certain people that I hadn't known existed. Worse, there were photos and medical reports indicating he had deliberately ignored certain responsibilities, ones that, if proven in court, could completely undermine his ability to retain custody or even guardianship. He had been hiding a second life, a secret that made the legal battle even more certain to turn in my favor. I felt a thrill I hadn't anticipated. The person I had raised, the man I had tried to guide, had created the exact conditions that would allow me to step in. Without him even realizing it, he'd made it possible for me to take control. That night, I sat on my bed staring at the folders, a storm of disbelief and vindication roiling inside me. I had planned revenge, yes, but fate, or perhaps karma, was speeding it up. By Friday, someone else would be knocking on their door, someone authorized, someone carrying the authority of the law, and by the time my son realized the full extent of what had happened, it would be too late to stop it. And yet, even with this advantage, I couldn't shake the fear that lingered. There was one more secret, one more piece of the puzzle, that could shatter everything I had just worked to control. I didn't know it yet, but it was coming. Friday morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Everything was in motion now. The detective had assured me that the authorities were prepared to intervene if necessary. My lawyer was ready with the emergency custody petition, and the folders I'd painstakingly assembled were airtight. But strategy required more than legal leverage. It required precision, timing, and psychological control. My son and his wife had underestimated me for too long, and I intended to make sure they fully understood the consequences of that dismissal. I started with logistics. I had to ensure the child would be safe, yes, but also shield myself from any sudden attempts to undermine the court or manipulate the situation. I mapped out the house, the neighborhood entry points, and the likely paths they'd take if they realized what was coming. I had no intention of confrontation, but control of the environment was crucial. I could already see how panic would affect them. Fear would cloud their judgment. Next, I crafted my communications. I wrote an email to my son and his wife, deliberately calm and neutral in tone. It stated that given recent events and the investigation, the child's safety was my priority, and any interference could result in legal consequences. I didn't include threats, I didn't have to. The authority backing me now did that implicitly. I had learned long ago that words could be far more terrifying when paired with proof. I also created a subtle layer of suspense. I arranged for my granddaughter's daycare teacher and pediatrician to be on standby. If the court needed additional testimony, it could be provided instantly without delay. Every single step I took had a dual purpose: protect the child, reinforce my credibility, and make my son and his wife question whether they had ever truly underestimated me, or if they had simply failed to notice I was capable of more than they could imagine. Then I thought about my son's patterns, the choices he had made, the ways he had allowed his marriage to dictate his judgment. It wasn't just about Jessica, it was about him too. He had ignored red flags, dismissed evidence, and ultimately jeopardized the child's well-being. I documented all of it. Notes from conversations, overlooked responsibilities, the subtle dismissals that didn't seem significant until lined up together. In court, this would paint him not as a negligent father entirely, but as someone complicit in decisions that endangered his own daughter. I spent the afternoon rehearsing my statements in front of the mirror. I needed calm, control, and authority. My son had always seen me as emotional, easy to manipulate, prone to overreaction. That facade was gone. I would speak facts, not feelings, and the law would back me. By evening, my phone buzzed. It was Detective Ramirez, confirming he would arrive at the son's house the next morning for a preliminary welfare check. He reminded me that any hint of confrontation should be avoided. My presence alone would suffice. I sat back, looking at the small bag I had packed earlier in the week. It wasn't just a bag of clothes and essentials anymore. It was the symbol of my readiness, of the transformation from a grandmother quietly dismissed to a force that would make my son and daughter-in-law reckon with their choices. I knew I had to wait until the right moment. Too soon, and they could manipulate the situation. Too late, and the opportunity could slip. Timing was everything, and I had all the time in the world because the law and my preparation were on my side. But the plan was only half of it. The other half required patience, observation, and the willingness to let fear work on them before any confrontation occurred. I had never enjoyed control in the abstract. I enjoyed it when it was earned, when every step was deliberate, and when the other person was blindsided by consequences they thought impossible. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the city hum outside my window, I realized that by the next morning, the first wave of change would hit. My son and his wife would wake up to a reality they hadn't anticipated, a reality where their control, their smug dismissal of me, and their sense of security were no longer valid. And I had only just begun. Saturday morning came with a chill that crept under my apartment door and made me tense, alert, ready. I left early, arriving at my son's house well before Detective Ramirez. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes every step sound loud. I parked down the street and watched the front door, noting every movement, every shadow, every curtain twitch. Then the unexpected happened. Jessica stepped outside first, dressed in workout clothes, coffee in hand. She paused on the porch, glanced around, and I could see panic flash across her face, subtle but unmistakable. She muttered something under her breath and then disappeared back inside. I knew immediately that she had suspected someone would come, but she didn't expect who. Seconds later, the twist hit me. My son followed her, holding the child, looking normal, calm, like nothing was happening. But as he stepped onto the porch, his phone rang. He answered it and his eyes went wide. Then he froze. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. His body language told the story. Shock, disbelief, panic, then subtle anger. And finally, the realization that he had been blindsided not by me, but by someone else entirely. I glanced down the street and saw Detective Ramirez pull up, his car lights muted but unmistakable. Ramirez exited, badge visible, authority radiating. My son's jaw tightened. My daughter-in-law's face turned pale. They were both realizing the full scope of the situation. I felt a surge of satisfaction, but it wasn't complete yet. There was one more revelation coming, and it hit me like a punch to the chest. My son, in his panic, muttered something to Ramirez about a hidden account, and she found out already. The she he referred to was not me. A sudden, icy fear and curiosity flooded me. Ramirez opened his briefcase again, this time pulling out another folder. Inside were documents detailing financial accounts, property deeds, and digital assets my son had been hiding for years, apparently tied to someone else entirely, someone powerful enough to intervene legally. He had been hiding money, investments, and assets that legally belonged in part to my granddaughter. My son had thought he could keep them secret, control them behind the scenes, manipulate the finances while maintaining the illusion of normalcy. But the moment I stepped back into the fight, everything he had tried to conceal was exposed. My mind raced. I realized that my son had unknowingly handed me a second weapon, one that wasn't emotional, wasn't procedural, but financial. The authorities could freeze the assets, the court could demand accountability, and the leverage wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about survival, about taking control of everything he had tried to dominate. Detective Ramirez turned to me. "This is all standard procedure," he said, but there was a sharpness in his voice, a subtle acknowledgement that what we were uncovering went beyond simple custody. "But these documents, they're significant. You're going to have options your son didn't anticipate." I looked at my son, his face pale, the child clinging to him, and I realized something chilling. This week wasn't just about proving who was responsible or capable. It was about exposing him for everything he had hidden. Every lie, every concealment, every choice that had hurt his daughter and disrespected me. And for the first time, I understood that the true power of revenge wasn't just in planning or patience, it was in revelation. Showing someone their life wasn't under their control anymore, showing them that every misstep, every betrayal, could be weaponized against them in a way they never imagined. By the end of the day, when the lawyers arrived and the official papers were served, my son and his wife weren't just scared. They were unprepared, cornered, and realizing, too late, that the very things they thought they controlled had been quietly dismantled. And I knew deep down that the final confrontation, the moment that would seal everything, was coming. Because it wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about consequences. That night, I sat in my car across the street from their house, watching the lights flicker on in the living room. My granddaughter was asleep upstairs, unaware of the storm that had descended around her. My son and his wife were packing, whispering heatedly, and I felt a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. I hadn't come to destroy them out of malice. I had come to protect her. That was the reason, the real reason, that drove everything I was doing. Years ago, before Jessica, before the house, before the daycare and the court filings, my son had made a promise to me. He promised he would never let anyone hurt his daughter, not like the mistakes I had made when raising him alone, not like his father had, not like life itself had sometimes forced upon us. He had promised me he would be a good man. But promises aren't always enough. I realized then why I had fallen in the kitchen that day. It wasn't just a literal fall, it was a signal. My body gave out because my patience, my tolerance for being disregarded and underestimated, had reached its limit. And when I saw my granddaughter's terrified face, I knew I couldn't trust them. Not her, not him, not their carefully constructed domestic facade, to do what was right, not anymore. Everything, the lawyer, the detective, the evidence, the second secret about my son's hidden assets, was a safeguard. Not for revenge alone, but to ensure that the child, the one person who had no choice in this, would be safe. She couldn't articulate fear the way adults could, but she had her own language. Trembling hands, wide eyes, silent cries. She didn't deserve the recklessness of her parents, and I wasn't about to let that go unaddressed. I thought about the first night I moved into her life, carrying her small body in my arms, hearing her sob into my shoulder. My son had laughed nervously at first, dismissing my concern, but I saw the truth behind his eyes, the flicker of doubt, the instinct that perhaps he wasn't doing enough. And I had finally realized something chilling. It wasn't just Jessica manipulating him. It was the illusion of control over the child's life itself. They believed that their roles, their authority, made them untouchable. They weren't. By the end of the week, when the court proceedings began, the child wouldn't just be temporarily removed from danger. The layers of deceit and negligence would unravel for everyone to see. My son's hidden financial maneuvers, his willingness to let small but critical neglect slide, Jessica's repeated disregard for safety, even the very fall that had started all of this, they all converged into a narrative so undeniable that the authorities, the court, and even the community wouldn't overlook it. I wasn't driven by spite. I was driven by a maternal instinct that had never wavered, even when it had been ridiculed, even when my body had given out, even when my own son called me pretending. I packed my bag once more that night, not for flight, but for presence. I would be in court, calm, prepared, untouchable. The person who would speak, submit evidence, and articulate the truth wasn't the same person who had been mocked in the kitchen. I had changed. I had adapted. I had become what they had thought I wasn't, unstoppable. And when I finally walked through the doors of the courthouse the next morning, I realized the last piece of my plan wasn't just evidence or legal maneuvering. It was watching my son and his wife understand, truly understand, the depth of what they had dismissed, the danger they had underestimated, and the consequences they had created by their carelessness. By the time the judge called the case, I wasn't nervous. I was resolved. The dramatic reason for every choice I had made, every document I had collected, every sleepless night, and every painful memory of being dismissed by my own family was crystal clear. This wasn't revenge for me, it was protection for her. But what neither of them knew yet, the final blow, was about to make that protection permanent. The courtroom was silent, almost too quiet. My son and Jessica sat together at the defense table, the child in Jessica's lap fidgeting nervously. I stood with my lawyer beside me, folders in hand, my granddaughter's safety and future resting on every piece of paper I had collected. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't nervous. I was precise, controlled, and fully aware of the impact about to unfold. The judge called the case, and my lawyer presented the petition for emergency custody. The evidence was undeniable. Photographs, medical records, daycare reports, timestamps, emails and notes from concerned third parties. Then came the twist my son hadn't seen coming, the documents showing his secret financial accounts, which he had intended to manipulate if the custody issue ever arose. The judge raised an eyebrow, flipping through the files, clearly concerned. I watched my son's face pale. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the space of 5 minutes. Jessica clutched the child closer, whispering to calm her, but even she realized they had no defense strong enough to counter the avalanche of evidence. Then my lawyer asked the critical question: had they knowingly endangered the child or failed to provide proper supervision? The answer wasn't just in testimony, it was in the pattern I had documented for months. My son faltered. Jessica tried to interject, but the judge silenced her. Every misstep, every neglectful act, every instance of dismissal and recklessness was laid bare. The judge didn't need to rule immediately. By the time the hearing recessed for a short break, my son and Jessica were visibly shaken, whispering frantically among themselves, realizing the consequences of their arrogance. That's when Detective Ramirez stepped in with the second twist, confirmation of the financial irregularities and hidden assets. The room went silent again. My son's jaw tightened, his eyes darted to me, pleading silently for some miracle, some leniency, but there was none. When the session resumed, the judge ruled. Temporary custody would be placed with me immediately. A full investigation into both the child's safety and the financial matters would proceed, and no visitation would occur without court supervision. I felt a strange calm wash over me, a satisfaction deeper than mere victory. My son finally looked at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, shame, disbelief. "Mom, he started, but I shook my head. Words weren't needed. I had already proven my point. The child's welfare, her safety, and the truth mattered more than his explanations. Jessica's face was pale, strained with anger and panic. I realized in that moment that the power they had taken for granted, the casual dismissal, the condescending words, the assumption that I couldn't handle it, had evaporated in 1 week. They were stripped of control, left only with the knowledge that their negligence had consequences far beyond their comprehension. I took my granddaughter's hand as we walked out. She didn't understand the legal weight, the secrets unveiled, or the manipulations exposed, but she felt safe, warm, and loved. That's all that mattered. As we stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, my son and Jessica lingered behind, their expressions haunted. They had underestimated me for years, mocked my strength, questioned my competence. But in that week, I had turned their world upside down, not out of anger, but out of protection and necessity. I didn't gloat, I didn't shout. I simply held my granddaughter close, walked to the car, and knew the fight wasn't over. But the first, most important victory was mine. The person they thought they could dismiss and control had reclaimed authority in the most complete, undeniable way. By the end of the week, they had lost control of what they had taken for granted, exposed secrets they hoped would remain hidden, and were left to face the consequences of their actions. I didn't need to do more. I didn't need to speak. The truth, the law, and the careful orchestration of months of preparation had done it for me. And as I buckled my granddaughter into her car seat, feeling the weight of her small hand clutch mine, I realized the ultimate revenge wasn't humiliation. It wasn't punishment. It was justice, quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. For the first time in years, I felt untouchable. I had fallen on the kitchen floor, yes, but I had risen stronger than they ever imagined. And this time, no one could stop me,